I was born in 1963 in a little village in India called Shadori.
And could you tell me a little bit about your family heritage and background, please?
My family's Punjabi Sikh, and I don't know what else to say, really.
What did your parents do? What did your parents do?
No, both my parents worked. I mean, my parents in India, I think, you know, worked in the field.
Right.
You know, were farmers.
Right.
As far as I can understand it. And then when they came over, they worked in factories. And as I said, my dad worked as a labourer in the steel industry. Right. And you know, and at that time, the Black Country, which is Smethwick was part of the Black Country, was a major industrial heartland.
So were your parents quite aspirational for you as you were growing up, in terms of education and wanting you to have a better life?
My parents were very traditional, and I think it was a tough life for them because my parents were, you know, weren't literate in English, and they couldn't read or write Punjabi either. So, and I was the oldest child, so we ended up. I ended up being the kind of linchpin to their kind of communication.
Oh, so you were like a go-between, an interlocutor for them and the culture that they
and actually, like most, you know, I think when people come across into a new country, you know, part of it is hanging on to what you're familiar with. And so, you know, some aspects of our life probably was more traditional than it would have been had we been in India, just because there was a safety around it. And, you know, you've got to remember that Smethwick was also the place where, you know, there was, you know, that sort of sense of Enoch Powell making speeches about, you know, his major speech around the rivers of blood happened in Smethwick, you know. So there was always that. Although I wasn't acutely aware of it when I was very young, as I grew older, you know, there was always that sort of issue around gender and race and the politics of that time. And, you know, it was grueling work, I think, for people. And then, of course, in the 80s, when this, you know, 70s and 80s, when the steel industry started to collapse and manufacturing collapsed, you know, I suspect there was a huge amount of pressure on those families to know how to make a living. It wasn't expected. I didn't think it wasn't approved of, you know, and it wasn't a job. It wasn't a proper job. And if you're a working class kid, you know, what your parents want for you is for you to be able to succeed. And as a young Asian woman, what they really wanted was for you to be to do the right thing, to marry the right person, to marry into the right family, to be a good wife, a good mother, and all of that kind of stuff. And I mean, the most likely, kind of at that time, the most likely things that were acceptable was being a teacher. And even that was a bit, you know, that was challenging. And I wanted to be a lawyer, is what I wanted to be. But I didn't think I would ever be allowed to do that because it would have taken 7 or 8 years of training, and I was at that point pretty convinced I wouldn't be able to go to college, never mind go to university. So I think for me the whole journey has just been out of a sense of curiosity.
Right.
That things, you know, key people have come into my life, opened a door, and I've gone, oh, that's interesting. And then I've been offered something, I'll go, oh, I've not done that before, I'll try that then. And I think I've ended up in the arts completely because of that kind of process. So I ended up in Yorkshire, partly because I didn't want to be a teacher, although in retrospect, I think that was possibly just a reaction because it was the one job that they might have supported. I think there was probably a little bit of me going, well, I can be something else. And I didn't push the legal side. I don't, you know, because I didn't think I'd get away with it. And there was always that negotiation of what do you think you can do. And I ended up coming up to Bradford to do a degree in applied social studies and be a social worker.
And what time period is this?
The early 80s.
The early 80s.
Yeah, in 82 I came up to Bradford, and in 82 there was a real the Ripper had just been caught. Women weren't, you know, there was a sense of protection around you as young women, so you weren't allowed to walk about on your own. So there was a certain generosity on campus and a kind of sense, even though he'd been caught, there was a sort of sense that one had to be careful. So there was something around all of that which was just interesting and different and a bit scary at times, I suppose. It was also a very, very different community, Bradford, from the community I'd come up, you know, because it's a predominantly Muslim community, and I do remember walking up the street from the centre of town, walking up the hill up towards the university with another student who was a white Irishman, who was a mate, and getting shouted at by some elders. And I have no idea what they were saying because I couldn't quite understand it, but it was clearly you know, a degree of abuse about what I was doing and why I was there. And so that was quite a noticeable shift in that, you know, there was some real sense that, you know, you were not supposed to be there, or you weren't supposed to be educating yourself. And so, you know, I think it was a complex time.
Yeah.
And I think it's also, you know, I think like any person going to university for the first time, you're standing on your own 2 feet, and for the first time making choices for yourself, and shifting from that place of being a young person in a particular context to suddenly being independent in a new environment, and so in a sense discovering yourself.
Yeah.
And I think that's partly through the people I met, and through the groups I joined, and through the kind of opportunities at the university, that it allowed me to really broaden my horizons. And of course Bradford was unique as a university in my view, but there was on site theatre in the Mill, and this extraordinary theatre building had a fellow in theatre and a fellow in music, and at the time the fellow in theatre, when I first came in 82, was Ruth Mackenzie, and she ran that space and also created shows with us as students, and was a pivotal person in my life, you know, and has been over all the time that she's been part of the arts world. And you know, so it was partly her kind of going, yeah, of course you can do this. And the first piece of work I was ever involved in was a political piece, which was based on a transcript of a court transcript of some stories about young Asian men from Bradford who were, you know, who'd been convicted. It was a kind of I don't know what the word is, a criminal, you know, an injustice,
right?
You know, so it was, you know, those things are now commonplace, you know, with the work that the Tricycle and places have done in terms of reenacting using verbatim material. But actually, in 1982-83, that was for us quite revolutionary, and Ruth enabled us to take some of that work into youth clubs in Bradford, you know, and it was powerful stuff, I guess. It was also the place I saw the very new, relatively new Phoenix Dance Company. You know, I had never seen anything like that before. You know, I'd been taken to see as part of my A-levels, I'd been to see The Winter's Tale at the Royal Shakespeare Company, and I'd never done much Shakespeare at my high school, so it was terrifying suddenly having to tackle Shakespeare at college in the context of kids who knew Shakespeare. But then going to see this production of The Winter's Tale, where I just felt like it was a completely alien world, you know. That it all looked lovely, but there was nothing on stage or that felt connected to me at all, you know. And so suddenly seeing something like Phoenix, these extraordinary black dancers bouncing off these walls in this tiny intimate space, was just like, oh, you know, you can have theatre can be like this too, or, you know, performing arts can be like this too. It was a real eye-opener, and I think Theatre in the Mill was quite pivotal in that sense, to be able to see work that I would never have seen before, or to be involved with arts practitioners that I would never have encountered before.
So did you begin your involvement as a performer?
I did. I was a terrible performer. Yeah, I did. I was in that. I was in a couple of shows. Yeah, and then I didn't really like it, to be honest. I got too nervous. I liked the idea of it, but I don't think I would have lasted very long as a performer. I ended up having to find a job and pay my way through, because I had some difficulties in terms of my grant and what have you. And so it was always there. I sort of would go and see stuff, but it was only, I stopped being in the shows, partly because I couldn't afford the time, largely, and partly because tracked me down to the restaurant and said, Ruth Mackenzie suggested you might be interested in a conversation with us. And that was because there was still a very strong arts community around, and she'd obviously remembered that I was working as a social worker, I was training as a social worker, so I had a huge connection in terms of the sort of access to young people through other projects like the youth service or the probation service or indeed social services. And it turned out that the phone call came from the artistic director, the recently appointed artistic director of Red Ladder, Rachel Feldberg, and she was trying to reinvent the company after a period of crisis and wanted to talk to me, or wanted someone like me to help them make relationships with the broader social services, probation and young people's sort of networks, because she wanted to focus the company's work in reaching young people through the youth service. Well, Red Ladders, you know, was first started in 1968. It's one of the only remaining companies from that socialist theatre movement, and it had been hugely successful. It had moved up from London to Bradford, to Leeds rather, to Lower Wortley. Had an old church as a building which they used as their rehearsal space and what have you. But in the early 80s, I think it had been a collective up to that point. I think in the 80s it began to have some difficulties, and a number of people pulled together and ensured that it would survive. And at that point, they brought in a new artistic director, and Rachel, you know, did an extraordinary job of reinventing it and launching it, and created a huge number of opportunities for people like myself to begin to work in a bit different way. And I think at that point it was a classic example where it was too enticing a phone call not to say, yes, I'll come and talk to you. You know, my first job was a sort of 6-week research thing for Rachel at Red Ladder, which was to just broker some relationships and help them think about the kinds of work that they could make that would help access those young people who weren't connected to the arts in any significant way. So it was almost like, well, a bit of a brainstorm, but also about who's a good person to go and talk to that you might know, and brokering some of those conversations. So it was a very, I don't know, it was an unusual step into the industry. They asked me to be their company manager, stage manager. I went, I don't know how to stage manage anything. Never stage managed anything. But you know, I think this is one of the things I've realised about myself over many years, is that just because I don't know how to do something doesn't necessarily stop me from doing it. And also within the right support and the right context, you know, curiosity gets the better of me. And if I don't know how to do it, I'll find out how to do it. And also, you know, stage managing Red Ladder shows at that time, you know, they were technically very, very simple. You'd have a couple of lights and you'd have a sound desk, you know, and I had great people who were prepared to help me, you know, to teach me how to plug things in. And
so was this touring in the region? Was this touring in the Yorkshire region that you were doing?
It was touring across the country.
Across the country.
Yeah,
right.
yeah. So we did a number of shows. We would always open in the region, right. And then it was a brilliant 2 years of learning about the whole of England, really. I mean, visiting places I'd never visited or knew anything about, you know, becoming really skilled at driving a very, very big lorry, big van, long wheelbase Mercedes van, which was fantastic, and getting looks across down the motorway, sitting with this wheel. So extraordinary encounters, but also just getting a sense of the diversity of the nation, you know. So we were doing shows in the middle of rural Norfolk, and or Lancashire, or you know, or in the heart of Yorkshire.
What was your sense of the nation at that time? Because is this early to mid 80s we're talking about now?
We're talking about late 80s.
Late 80s,
yeah, 86 to about 88, right. when I first got myself involved in Red Ladder. And well, I mean, I guess it was interesting in terms of you know, the kind of challenges or the issues young people face, and the kind of stories that we were telling weren't dissimilar across the country. You know, I think what was interesting was going into those communities where there was a strong sense of the urban-rural divide. And in fact, we did a show that played around with Rona Munro wrote a piece that explored that, and there was also quite a strong sense of the gender differences. You know, the politics, the feminist kind of sensibility was still, you know, you would still go into youth clubs where you would have boys' nights, and you know, they would have activity for, you know, to play football or snooker, you know, pool or whatever, and very little for the girls, you know. And there was I do remember there being a strong sense of a kind of youth service movement about trying to recognise and explore what young women wanted in youth clubs, and how to facilitate their needs and wants. So there was something around all of that was, you know, politically interesting. And I think there was also very little work that was going on with those communities that were underrepresented, whether that was, you know, we you know, it's always hard to know whether you're the first at anything, but you know, I remember we did a pilot project called One of Us, which was a piece that Mira Sile had originally written as part of her degree course, I think, and that she'd performed in Edinburgh. But we took that round to a very small tour in Yorkshire to young Asian women, and that was such a huge success. And it was just a one-woman show with myself as stage manager and Venu Duper as performer, that it led to us us researching a whole new piece of work that was called Bhangra Girls, which was written by Nandita Ghosh, and ended up touring nationally and was very, very successful, and consequently went on to become to be done by the BBC. So I mean, I think I think we were always looking at where the gaps were, right, and what the gaps were, and trying to look at what the questions our work could ask. And I suppose what that meant in the context of Red Ladder was that I was part of a company, because they had this kind of holistic ability to talk. You weren't just doing your stage management, company management. You were invited to be part of the conversations in the rehearsal room. You were invited to be part of the strategic planning and the sort of policy drivers for the future. And I think there was a real generosity. Right. Theatre is all about relationships. Yeah. Theatre making is all about relationships, and sometimes in those contexts you can be very, very open. Other times you have to be very directive. But I think in the end, it's hard for it not to be a collaborative process, because you can't do it on your own. Yeah. And it's as much a collaboration with the audience as it is with the performer or the creative team. I think it's very hard to sort of generalise whether that movement is across the years has changed or not. I think it probably is very driven by the values and the kind of approaches to making work that different people take.
Right. Okay. So you were with Red Ladder, and then what was your what were your next movements or moves or impetus?
I went back to social work.
Okay.
I went and did the job I was trained to do. Okay. Just because I felt like I had to, because I felt like I'd played away for a bit. Uh-huh. And so I think it was about 1987.
And was this in Yorkshire that you were practising your social work?
Yeah, I went back to, I worked for Bradford Social Services. Right. And worked in the South West office, which covered Buttershore Estate and places like that. And I worked in the long-term family team. So, tough. It was tough, and really challenging work. Worked with some extraordinary social workers. Worked with some extraordinary families, actually, who were trying their best in sometimes extremely hard circumstances.
Rita Sue
and Bob too, yeah.
Is that based on the Buttershore Estate?
It is, yeah.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah.
So you were kind of living...
I was in that world.
You were in that world of teenage whatever, and alcoholism, but pre-drugs, of course. Relatively pre-drugs, pre-hard drugs.
Yeah.
Has now blighted those estates.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what... I don't have that same relationship with Bradford now that I used to have, because obviously from 82 till 2001 I lived in Bradford, but I kind of, in that period of being at university and being a student and working for social services or the education department as part of a trainee, and then going back to Buttershore or the South West office, as it was now, South West office, yes. Those are very particular periods of time, and also you've got to remember that in that context, we'd also got the rise of Thatcher and the Thatcherite approach to economics and also to care services, social services, and we moved from. This is my own reflection, and others might disagree, but it feels like, one of the reasons why I decided not to carry on and came back into the arts was that it became clear that social services were becoming more and more of a policing role rather than a preventative, supportive role to make families work and support those people who were really struggling. And I sort of found, I suppose, part of the history of having done some of the work in with the youth service as part of Red Ladder and community, you know, and arts organisations like that, was that there were other ways to enable, you know, communities to articulate their needs or to explore ways of being and existing and working, that I felt that the arts could liberate. And so, and also, a number of people kept saying to me, "What are you doing? So come back, come back." And I would often get sent adverts for jobs. And then this, you know, there was the Arts Council and Mercer's Company came together and were doing these bursaries for trainee directors and trainee designers. And so eventually I kind of went, okay, I'll apply. And I applied for a training bursary, and got that.
And so that was your entry into the world of being an artistic director for theatre. And just and out of the region then.
No, because my trainee, I chose to stay in the region because Major Road was one of the companies that were offering these placements, the placement, and so I spent a year with Major Road in Bradford.
Right.
And then continued to work with them as a freelancer, and did some freelancing for them, did some freelancing work for Red Ladder, did my first proper directing job for Red Ladder.
Right.
And then then did some work for the BBC, you know, went down to London. Even though I went to London, I still lived, my base was still in Yorkshire.
So Yorkshire has been quite instrumental in the formation of.
Yeah, I've never left Yorkshire. So even when I went to Contact, I was still living in Yorkshire.
Right.
Even when I was artistic director at Leicester, I still had my base here, although I lived during the week in Leicester. So it is, I do call Yorkshire my home.
Right.
But yeah, I suppose whenever, I suppose because Yorkshire was my home from home,
right,
that actually I've always come back here.
Right.
And I now have family, you know, my son has grown up here, and there's a whole network of friends, and friends who are my family up here, that it feels like that's important.
So you've done this bursary in artistic direction.
Yeah.
Gone to London to work.
Or I might have gone to London before. I can't remember. Who knows?
Chronology. Don't worry, we'll sort it out. And then you came back and worked for Red Ladder, did you?
I came back and worked as a freelancer for a while. Yeah,
right.
And did a variety of things, but essentially worked in the region. And then I think it was 1994. The artistic leadership of Red Ladder came up, and I applied for it. It was kind of terrifying, but I was lucky enough to be, supported in getting it. So, from '94 to '98, I was the artistic director of Red Ladder. Yeah. Which big learning curve, from being a freelancer to suddenly being responsible for a company, and also a company that at that time, in the 90s, anything with Red in their name was likely to not last very long. The politics of the time were such that it was tricky, and our mission statement said we were a socialist feminist company, and we stood by that, and it was tough. It was potentially tough, but also it was a great opportunity to kind of really consolidate on what the company had been really good at, but also expand it. And one of the things I feel most proud of from that period is that we in partnership with Theatre in the Mill and Kate Chapman, who was fellow in theatre there, set up the sort of first ever Asian theatre school that enabled young people from the Asian communities to kind of skill up. Yeah. And we did this residency every year, and it was a huge success. And in fact, it became, it is it is a consequence of that that's, you know, that now Freedom Studios exist, because Freedom Studios was the Asian Theatre School under Madani, you know, after I'd gone. So that was, you know, that's a really brilliant example of something where you could tangibly make something happen that's had a life beyond your input to it with other people, you know. And I think the other thing that, you know, during my period at Red Ladder, of course, Red Ladder became 30 years old, you know, and so we had a major conference event hosted by David Edgar and the University of Birmingham called Better Red, which allowed some of the founder members and all of that kind of history of the socialist theatre movement to kind of have a moment to kind of reflect and reconsider where we'd got to at that point by 98, and kind of what the new political work was that was beginning to surface or not surface, or what the political context we were all working in at that point. And that was a fascinating weekend, you know, in terms of meeting some of the founder members of Red Ladder and other companies, but B, also just taking stock, I guess, you know, kind of enabling people to come together in a context of a conversation.
And out of that conversation at that time, what things do you think you'd witnessed changed in the kind of artistic and social landscape in the country, this country?
Well, I mean, I guess one clear scenario was that those early companies all were set up as collectives.
Right.
And, you know, by the time we'd got into the 90s, we were, you know, the arts infrastructure was much more geared to, you know, hierarchies and chief executive positions and boards, and there was much more of a formalizing process. So, and that was obviously driven by funding needs and the kind of way in which suddenly we were all expected to be businesses, as if we weren't businesses. But you know, that the formality of having to. And I think there's some very interesting conversations around leadership and the importance of leadership, but the importance of the nature of leadership around, you know. In fact, even just the other day, you know, we're looking at sort of the kind of models around collaborative leadership, or can't remember what the phrase was, but more authoritative leadership, you know, and where you place yourself. And I think there's still a sort of sense in which the arts have to increasingly justify their existence, and I mean that's always been the case. You know, when I was at Red Ladder, you know, trying to fight for an organisation like Red Ladder to be recognised as an artistic organisation, because the work was seen to be, you know, not mainstream enough or too community orientated. And I think there's been a period where all of that community engagement conversation has kind of come into the mainstream, but not necessarily all of the understanding of of what's best practice around that has come into the mainstream. So we understand it, or we can talk about it, we've got the words for it, but we don't always have the expertise to really make that truly grounded. And but I also think we're now kind of going back into the arguments between art for art's sake and arts for social cohesion or social benefit. You know, I think those are interesting conversations that are still happening, and I think they'll become more acute as we get into a situation where the value of arts is under pressure, or the question and interrogation of whether you know, we should be investing in the arts to the levels that have happened in the past, you know, and when people begin to sort of go, you know, it's in my view, you know, not a particularly helpful conversation to say, well, who needs the arts when we need more hospitals or more schools, you know, because actually I would say we all need a thriving culture as human beings, and culture is made up of our stories and our histories and our ways of interacting, and the arts play a major role in that, you know, harnessing that creative potential. And so I think there is a bigger conversation that is sort of happening, but we need to carry on making happen, particularly in this time of austerity, as everybody calls it. You know, and I suppose as artists, you know, we're at our best when we're provocative and we are able to kind of capture something of and shine a light on something that is about the here and now and about the big challenges and the big questions. And I think we need to kind of embrace that opportunity. It's hard. I mean, I don't think it was hard in the 80s. It'll be hard now. You know, those. You know, but in a funny sort of way, the arts become even more important in those periods. I think there's an innate curiosity in me that I'm not very good at routine, and I'm not very good at doing the same things over again. And so I'm interested in breaking the rules, not just for the sake of breaking the rules, but in order to make something better or to test something. And I suppose that is driven by a politic, which is something to do with we're capable of having a better place to inhabit, and we all have a responsibility to make that betterness, if you like. And that sounds very pompous, I guess, maybe, or arrogant, but there is something about trying to go. Life wasn't easy when my parents' life wasn't easy for them. Life wasn't particularly easy for me, but actually it's our duty to try and make it better for the next generation, and or to offer opportunities that I didn't have, and so or kids like me don't have, and in some circumstances, you know, I witnessed that things haven't moved. Well, I went to Contact to help them create a new artistic vision, and working with Fiona Gasper, we created the new organisational model and looked at galvanising the board and the important stakeholders to kind of sign up to that artistic vision, which is, you know, thriving at Contact. But one of the interesting things that happened to me at that point was that as part of that, during my time there, I was pregnant. I found I was pregnant, and so I then was involved in recruiting a new artistic director, and John McGrath came in and then ran the building. You know, took it on, and we've had a very close relationship since, and he's done an extraordinary job in kind of taking the initial ideas and really making them come to life. And I suppose in that, although I wasn't there full time, I became an associate of the company and worked with John and the team there, and have had a long history with the company since. So I suppose it's my spiritual home. I call it my spiritual home because it felt like a really important period, and also I've been able to go back and make work there with those young people, and when John left a couple of years ago to set up and run National Theatre of Wales, I went back as an interim director to kind of help bring in a new generation of artistic director and continue to kind of work in that way. And I guess that's been a really important part of my own journey, because it felt like it harnessed lots of things in one place, you know. And another project that I feel particularly proud of is Contacting the World, which, you know, was an idea that came out of a conversation that Noel, Greg and I had in India in 1998 when I was still at Red Ladder, but actually didn't come to full fruition until 2001, when the first ever Contacting the World project happened, which was twinning young people in this country with young people making theatre in other countries, and then all coming to, you know, through a process of exchange and conversation, making work, and then sharing that work in Manchester over an intensive week-long festival. And it happens every 2 years, and it's got an extraordinary family and an extraordinary potency around that practice, and there's been some brilliant work that's been created as a consequence. So I sort of feel like the legacy of Contact is really important and significant, and some of the young artists and the talent that's coming from that place is, you know, keeps me artistically nourished as well, you know. So it's not that I've done something, it's just that I've been part of a process that's created a space for lots of voices to kind of articulate and their stories and their ideas and unleash their creative practice. And I think, you know, it's very refreshing to see that. I went from, you know, I went from being from Contact. I ended up going to Leicester Haymarket as co-artistic director, so I went and worked in one of the major repertory theatres in the country, and I spent about 5.5 years, nearly 6 years as co-artistic director there, and then came back to Yorkshire. Well, I mean, I never moved out of Yorkshire, as I said before, but I gave that up and came back to being a bit of a freelancer. And so I've spent since 2007, I kind of done some freelancing work, including going back to Contact and making a diverse range of work. And then last autumn, I took on a full-time job in Doncaster, and they're director of a new venue that is currently being built called Cast, and which we hope to launch this autumn. And that's, you know, it's an interesting and challenging project in the context of a town that doesn't have a huge cultural offer in that it doesn't have a venue that's of that scale. That, you know, that the Civic Theatre is a local theatre that has been around for a long time, but the local authority have supported the building of a 620-seat theatre and a studio theatre and a dance studio, and you know, and it's an interesting time to be opening a brand new building.
And how does it feel?
Terrifying and exciting. It's hard. I mean, you know, there's at the minute, you know, there's just so much to do, and there's not enough hours in the day to do it. But yeah, you know, always up for the challenge.
Thank you very much for your conversation. I think that's a journey that you've described in the time that we've had, Kully.
Yeah.
So thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And good luck.
Thank you.